There's a couple from my hometown that people still talk about sometimes, not in the dramatic kind of way. Nobody ever called them soulmates back then. Nobody looked at them and thought they were part of some grand love story that would survive generations. Most people just knew them as Walter and Eleanor, two quiet old people who walked very slowly together through the farmer's market every Saturday morning, no matter the weather. Walter always wore the same brown jacket with the worn elbows. Eleanor always carried one of those little folding shopping carts, even when there was barely anything inside it. If you saw them near the end of their lives, you'd probably assume they had been together forever, but the strange thing was, most of their lives were actually spent apart. Walter was 92 when they got married. Eleanor was 90. And somehow, after nearly 70 years of knowing each other, they still acted nervous around one another sometimes. Walter first met Eleanor in the summer of 1951. At least that's the version he always told. Eleanor claimed it was autumn. They argued about it for years. Walter insisted it was summer because he remembered sweating through his shirt while standing outside the old pharmacy on Maple Street waiting for the bus. Eleanor said it had to be autumn because she remembered leaves blowing across the sidewalk and the fact that she was borrowing her sister's yellow coat. Either way, Walter noticed her immediately, not because she was loud or beautiful in some movie star kind of way. He always said it was because she looked completely calm while everybody around her seemed rushed. Even at 17 years old, Eleanor apparently carried herself like someone much older. Walter, on the other hand, was awkward beyond belief. The first time he tried speaking to her, he accidentally dropped a glass Coke bottle outside the diner across the street and it shattered across the sidewalk. Eleanor laughed so hard she snorted, which embarrassed her enough that she walked away without even telling him her name. Walter apparently replayed that moment in his head for weeks afterward. That's another thing about real love stories people don't talk about enough. Most of them start embarrassingly, not elegantly. A few days later, he saw her again sitting alone inside the diner near the window reading a newspaper while eating pie. He spent almost 20 minutes outside trying to build up the courage to walk in. The waitress eventually opened the door herself and yelled, "You gonna stand there staring all day or what?" Walter told that story every anniversary after they got married. Eleanor hated it because she said it made him sound pathetic. Maybe he was, but he walked inside, and somehow that became the beginning of everything. They started seeing each other slowly after that. Not official dates at first, more like excuses to accidentally exist near one another. Walter would walk Eleanor home from church even when it added 40 minutes to his own walk back. Eleanor started pretending to need groceries from the market Walter worked at, even though the prices there were worse. There was one story Eleanor's younger sister told years later about catching Walter standing outside their house one evening holding a peach pie he had baked himself. Apparently, he forgot pot holders and burned both his hands carrying it. The pie itself was terrible, completely raw in the middle. Eleanor still ate some of it anyway while Walter sat there apologizing over and over. That's the kind of detail nobody invents. By winter, they were inseparable. Walter had started military training around that time though, and everybody knew eventually he'd be sent overseas. People forget how normal that used to be. Young men would disappear for years, and life simply expected everybody else to continue moving. Still, Walter and Eleanor made promises to each other the way young people do when they think love alone can defeat time. Walter told her he'd come back and marry her. Eleanor believed him. I think he believed it too. The night before Walter left, they sat together on the hood of his truck outside the lake just beyond town limits. Walter later admitted neither of them really talked much that night. They mostly just listened to crickets and watched headlights move along the distant highway. At one point, Eleanor rested her head on his shoulder and quietly asked, "What if we become different people?" Walter didn't answer right away. Finally, he said, "Then hopefully we become different people together." Eleanor cried when she repeated that story decades later, because that's not what happened. At first, they wrote constantly, sometimes twice a week. Walter's letters wandered all over the place. Half the time, he barely even discussed himself. He described strange meals he ate overseas or complained about rain leaking through ceilings wherever he was stationed. One letter was apparently almost entirely about a stray dog that followed him through a train station in Germany. Eleanor kept that one folded inside a cookbook for over 60 years, not because it was romantic, because it sounded like him. That's the thing people misunderstand about long love. Eventually, it's the ordinary details you miss most. The way somebody complains, the weird stories they tell, the exact phrasing they use. Eleanor wrote differently. Her letters were careful and neat, and usually much shorter. She'd tell Walter about town gossip, weather changes, or what flowers had started blooming behind the church. Sometimes she included pressed flowers inside the envelopes. Walter kept every one, even after everything that happened later. But life has a way of slowly interrupting people. Eleanor's father got sick first, then Walter's deployments became longer. Phone calls back then were expensive and rare. Weeks became months, months became years. And eventually, something dangerous happened. They started adjusting to the silence, not all at once. Slowly, painfully slowly. Eleanor eventually met another man through church, a stable man, kind, local, the kind of man her family trusted. Walter was still overseas when she got engaged. Apparently, she sat awake nearly the entire night before finally mailing the letter telling him. Walter received it weeks later. Years afterward, he admitted he reread the letter so many times the folds nearly tore apart. But even then, he said he understood. That's the heartbreaking part. Nobody betrayed anybody. Life simply kept moving forward. Walter married too eventually, had children, worked maintenance at a middle school for decades. Eleanor became a librarian and raised 3 daughters, and somehow they continued orbiting each other across the years without fully reconnecting. Sometimes it was accidental, a funeral, a Christmas card, passing each other in the grocery store. One time in the late 70s, Walter apparently drove 3 hours just to attend a retirement dinner where he knew Eleanor might be there, not because he planned on speaking to her, just because he wanted to see her again. He sat 3 tables away the entire night, never approached her once. Eleanor later admitted she noticed him immediately when he walked in. She remembered exactly what tie he wore. That's what makes this story sad to me. Not that they lost each other, it's that they never completely did. Their spouses both passed away within a few years of one another, after they were already deep into old age. By then, Walter's hands shook badly from arthritis. Eleanor walked carefully after a hip surgery. Most people at that age are surrounded more by memories than plans. But somehow, after almost 60 years, they slowly found their way back into each other's daily lives. Walter started visiting Eleanor every Thursday evening. At first, it was under practical excuses, fixing loose cabinets, changing light bulbs, helping shovel snow. But Eleanor's daughter later said Walter would often spend 3 hours fixing things that were perfectly fine. Really, he just wanted reasons to stay. The two of them would sit together drinking weak coffee while old game shows played quietly in the background. Sometimes they barely talked. And strangely, those might have been their happiest moments. Because when you love somebody for that long, silence stops feeling uncomfortable. It starts feeling earned. One winter morning, Eleanor slipped on ice near her mailbox. Nothing life-threatening, just bruises. But Walter cried when he saw her arm in a sling. Actually cried. Her daughter said that was the moment she realized something. These two people had spent their entire adult lives accidentally waiting for each other, and suddenly time didn't feel unlimited anymore. Walter proposed one rainy afternoon while they were eating canned tomato soup in Eleanor's kitchen. No ring, no dramatic speech. He just looked at her quietly for a few seconds and said, "Well, we probably shouldn't waste more time." Eleanor laughed so hard she started crying. Then Walter started crying too. They got married 6 months later in a tiny church with maybe 15 people attending. Walter wore an old gray suit he already owned because he said buying a new one at 92 felt financially irresponsible. That was his exact phrase. Eleanor carried flowers clipped from her own garden early that morning. There's a photograph from that wedding that always stayed with me. Not the one where they kiss, not the posed family pictures either. It's one taken during the ceremony itself. Walter is staring down at their hands, while Eleanor squeezes his fingers gently, and he looks almost confused, like some part of him genuinely never expected to live long enough to finally stand there beside her. Two people who lost nearly 60 years somehow still finding their way back to one another. That image honestly says more about love than most movies ever could. Walter died peacefully 2 years later. Eleanor passed less than a year after him. Her daughter said that near the end, Eleanor spent a lot of time rereading old letters beside the window in the afternoons, especially the boring ones, the letters about weather, the train rides, the sandwiches Walter hated. One of the nurses asked her once why those letters mattered so much. Eleanor smiled and said, "Because that's where his life was." And according to her daughter, one of the final things Eleanor ever said before she died was, "I'm just glad we made it back to each other." Not "I love him," not some dramatic final sentence, just "I'm glad we made it back." And honestly, I think that might be the most beautiful love story I've ever heard. There's a man in my neighborhood named Arthur that everybody used to be terrified of. Not in some dangerous criminal kind of way. More like the kind of person who could make an entire room feel nervous just by walking into it. Arthur had been a judge downtown for almost 40 years. A real old-school courtroom judge, too. The kind that still polished his shoes every morning before sunrise and believed people should stand up straighter when speaking. Even after retirement, he still carried himself like he was entering a courtroom everywhere he went. Perfect posture, perfect suits, perfect silence. Kids on our street used to freeze whenever Arthur walked by with his little brown briefcase and gray overcoat. Not because he ever yelled at anybody. Honestly, that would have been less intimidating. It was the way he looked at people, like he was quietly evaluating whether they belonged there. Arthur lived alone in the small brick house near the end of Willow Lane after his wife Margaret passed away sometime in the early 2000s. Nobody ever saw visitors there after that. Every morning he followed the exact same routine. He'd leave the house at 7:30 sharp, carrying a thermos of coffee, and walk exactly 3 blocks to the same diner downtown. He always ordered oatmeal, black coffee, and toast. Then he'd sit silently by the window reading newspapers for nearly 2 hours. Same booth, same waitress, same routine. One of the waitresses once told my dad that Arthur never smiled once in the 15 years she served him. Not once. That honestly became part of his reputation around town. Kids called him the hanging judge, even though none of them really understood what that meant. Parents lowered their voices around him instinctively. Even neighborhood dogs seemed strangely quiet whenever he walked past. But the weird thing was, nobody actually had a story about Arthur being cruel. He never screamed at anybody, never insulted anybody, never caused problems. He just seemed permanently disappointed in the entire world, especially after Margaret died. People said before her death he used to be different. Softer somehow. Apparently Margaret was one of those warm women who remembered birthdays and baked things for neighbors and somehow convinced Arthur to attend block parties despite hating them. After she passed, that version of him disappeared too. For years, Arthur became almost ghost-like around the neighborhood. You'd see him watering plants, shoveling snow, collecting mail, but never really living. Then one summer afternoon, everything changed because of a birthday party. It belonged to the Hernandez family across the street. Their youngest daughter, Sophia, was turning 8, and like most neighborhood birthday parties, it was loud beyond belief. Kids screaming, music playing, plastic tables everywhere, half-melted popsicles dripping onto sidewalks. Arthur absolutely hated noise. Everybody knew that. At one point, a soccer ball accidentally rolled into Arthur's front yard while he was trimming hedges near the walkway. The music stopped almost immediately. A couple of the kids froze completely. One of Sophia's older brothers slowly walked toward Arthur's yard, looking like he was approaching a wild animal. Arthur picked up the ball before the kid reached him, and for a second everybody genuinely thought he was going to puncture it or throw it away. Instead, Arthur stared down at the ball quietly before asking, "Whose birthday is it?" The little girl raised her hand nervously from across the street. Arthur looked at her for another few seconds. Then, completely expressionless, he reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a quarter from behind the soccer ball. Nobody understood what happened at first. Even the kids looked confused. Arthur himself actually looked slightly confused too. Then he handed Sophia the quarter and muttered, "Happy birthday." That was it. But something about that tiny moment changed everything. Mostly because it was the first time anybody in years had seen Arthur attempt anything playful. The following week, another strange thing happened. One of the neighborhood kids claimed Arthur made a flower disappear during a sidewalk conversation. Then another kid said Arthur somehow pulled a candy wrapper out of his sleeve. At first, everybody assumed the children were exaggerating, until Arthur appeared at another birthday party holding an old black magician's case that looked older than most cars on the street. Apparently, it had belonged to Margaret. That's what he later told people. Margaret used to love magic shows when they were younger. Arthur himself had apparently learned a few simple tricks decades earlier just to make her laugh during difficult periods in their marriage. Somewhere along the way, he stopped doing them entirely. But after Sophia's birthday party, something resurfaced. At first, Arthur's magic was honestly terrible. That's part of why everybody loved it so much. Scarves got tangled. Cards fell onto the grass. Coins rolled away into storm drains. One time, a fake dove accidentally escaped early from his coat pocket during a retirement barbecue, and Arthur spent 20 minutes chasing it through somebody's hydrangea bushes while children screamed, laughing behind him. That was the first time most people ever heard Arthur laugh. A real laugh. Not polite, not restrained. Actual laughter. And weirdly enough, it sounded young. After that, Arthur slowly became part of the neighborhood in a way he never had before. Kids started knocking on his door, asking to see tricks. Parents invited him to parties automatically. Some evenings, people walking past Arthur's house could hear old jazz records playing softly through open windows while he practiced card shuffling alone at the kitchen table. There was one little boy named Ben from 2 streets over who became especially attached to Arthur. Ben had a stutter and barely spoke around adults, but for some reason he trusted Arthur immediately. Arthur started teaching him card tricks on Thursday afternoons. At first, their lessons barely involved conversation, mostly silence, card shuffling, the ticking kitchen clock. But over time, Ben started speaking more confidently around him. One afternoon, Ben's mother actually cried watching her son perform a card trick in front of people for the first time without stuttering once. Arthur pretended not to notice her crying. That seemed to be his way of handling emotional moments, ignoring them gently. Eventually, people began learning things about Arthur they never knew before, like the fact he loved strawberry ice cream, or that he secretly watched old comedy shows every night, or that Margaret used to call him Artie, which shocked everybody because nobody could imagine Arthur as somebody's Artie. The biggest surprise, though, was discovering Arthur wasn't naturally cold at all. He was lonely. There's a difference. And once people stopped fearing him, Arthur slowly stopped hiding too. Every Halloween, he started performing magic tricks on his porch for neighborhood kids. By his 3rd year doing it, families from nearby towns were showing up just to watch him perform. Arthur would stand beneath orange string lights wearing this ridiculous sequined cape that honestly looked homemade. He took the performances incredibly seriously too. Way too seriously. He'd rehearse constantly, write little introductions, practice dramatic pauses and mirrors. And despite all that preparation, something went wrong almost every single time. Props broke, cards disappeared too early, fake flowers got stuck in sleeves. But nobody cared, because Arthur himself had become the magic trick. Watching this stern old judge slowly transform into somebody joyful felt impossible if you remembered the man he used to be. One winter evening after a Christmas party, my father ended up helping Arthur carry boxes back into his garage after a performance. Inside the garage were shelves filled with magic props, hundreds of them, silk scarves, card decks, fake rabbits, old posters, tiny smoke machines. My dad asked Arthur when he found time to collect all of it. Arthur apparently sat down quietly for a moment before saying, "It's easier being ridiculous than being sad." That line spread around the neighborhood for years afterward, because I think everybody understood exactly what he meant. Arthur kept performing well into his 80s. His hands shook badly near the end, which made the tricks even messier, but somehow that made them more lovable too. Kids would cheer even when tricks failed completely, maybe louder when they failed. One of Arthur's final performances happened during a block party just a few months before he died. He stood beneath string lights, in that same ridiculous cape, trying to perform a card trick while wind kept blowing the cards across the lawn. At one point, Arthur stopped mid-trick, looked down at the scattered cards, and just started laughing. Really laughing. The kind of laugh that folds people over slightly. The whole neighborhood laughed with him, not at him, with him. And for a moment, Arthur didn't look like a retired judge or an old lonely widower or the terrifying man everybody once feared. He just looked happy. Arthur died peacefully later that winter. Afterward, the neighborhood held a memorial gathering in the park across from his house. People brought flowers, photographs, playing cards. Ben performed one of Arthur's old tricks during the memorial. His hands shook the entire time. But afterward, he said something I still think about a lot. He said, "Arthur taught me magic tricks, but mostly he taught people not to be scared of each other." And honestly, I think that might have been the best thing he ever did. There's a police officer in my hometown people still talk about sometimes, though probably not for the reasons you'd expect. His name was Officer Miller, and for most of my childhood, everybody was at least a little afraid of him. Not because he was abusive or aggressive or one of those cops constantly screaming at people. Honestly, Officer Miller barely raised his voice at all. That was part of what made him intimidating. He carried himself with this strange level of control that made everybody around him instinctively stand up straighter. Even other officers seemed careful around him. Miller had been on the force for over 20 years by the time this story happened. He worked mostly night patrols downtown and apparently volunteered for the shifts nobody else wanted. Rainstorms, holidays, winter overnights, things like that. People said he slept maybe 4 hours a night at most. He lived alone in a small duplex near the edge of town after his divorce sometime in the late 90s. Nobody really knew much else about his personal life because Miller almost never discussed it. He wasn't rude exactly, just closed off, like somebody who learned a long time ago that emotions complicated things unnecessarily. Even the way he spoke sounded disciplined. Short sentences, calm tone, no wasted words. There was one diner waitress who once joked that Officer Miller ordered coffee the same way he probably read Miranda rights. Black, no sugar. That was apparently his exact order every single night for nearly 15 years. The strange thing, though, was that people trusted him deeply. If Miller showed up somewhere, things calmed down. Bar fights ended quicker. Drunk people cooperated. Nervous witnesses settled down. Not because he threatened anybody, because his composure made everybody else feel slightly embarrassed to lose theirs. At least that's how my father explained it. Then one October night, everything changed because of 7 puppies. It had been raining heavily most of the evening. One of those miserable cold rains where sidewalks shine under streetlights and everything smells faintly like wet concrete and exhaust. Miller was finishing up a patrol near the old textile district around 2 in the morning when he heard what he initially thought was birds somewhere behind a dumpster near an alleyway. Except birds don't usually cry like that. Miller later admitted the sound bothered him instantly because it sounded panicked, not loud, desperate. He followed the noise down the alley using his flashlight and eventually found a soaked cardboard box shoved beside a chain-link fence behind a closed laundromat. Inside were 7 tiny puppies piled on top of each other, shaking violently from the cold. They couldn't have been more than a few weeks old. One of them was so weak it apparently barely lifted its head when the flashlight hit the box. Now here's the thing people found funny later. Officer Miller genuinely did not know what to do. Not with armed suspects, not with emergencies, and not with danger. With puppies, apparently he just stood there in the rain staring at the box for a solid 30 seconds, like his brain stopped functioning entirely. Eventually he radioed dispatch and awkwardly asked if animal control was still operating at that hour. They weren't, so dispatch basically told him, "Congratulations, they're your problem until morning." One of the officers later said Miller sounded more stressed during that radio call than during actual armed standoffs. He ended up placing the entire box carefully into the back seat of his patrol car. For the first time in department history, apparently, Officer Miller spent the remainder of a night shift driving around with 7 whining puppies buckled into police blankets behind him. And according to another officer, Miller kept checking the rearview mirror every few seconds, like he was transporting explosives. The next problem came when he brought them home, because once again, Miller had absolutely no idea what he was doing. He owned almost nothing remotely useful for caring for animals. No pet food, no bowls, no blankets besides old police extras. At one point, he apparently fed the puppies bits of scrambled eggs off paper towels because that was the only thing he could think of at 3 in the morning. The following day, he showed up at a pet supply store still wearing his uniform after working all night and bought what employees later described as basically the entire puppy section. Formula, toys, tiny collars, bedding, training pads. One cashier said Miller looked deeply uncomfortable the entire time, like he was trying to defuse a bomb using instructions written in another language. Things became significantly more chaotic after that, because 7 puppies inside a small duplex is apparently what psychologists would classify as a complete collapse of domestic order. Miller's life transformed almost overnight. The man who once ironed his shirts with military precision now regularly had puppy food smeared across his sleeves before sunrise. His perfectly quiet house suddenly sounded like constant tiny disasters. Whining, barking, scratching, things falling over. Neighbors later said they started seeing Miller outside at absurd hours looking completely exhausted while trying to herd 7 puppies through wet grass before work. One puppy named Moose became especially attached to him. Moose followed Miller everywhere. Bathroom, kitchen, front porch. There's a body cam clip one of the officers secretly recorded where Moose somehow climbs halfway up Miller's uniform pants during a briefing, while Miller continues discussing paperwork, completely seriously, without acknowledging it once. The entire department apparently lost their minds laughing afterward. That's another thing people noticed. Miller slowly started laughing more, not huge dramatic laughter, just little cracks in his composure that almost seemed accidental. One officer said the first time he heard Miller genuinely laugh was after one of the puppies fell asleep inside Miller's police boot during a shift briefing. Apparently, Miller looked down at the boot for a few seconds before quietly muttering, "Well, that complicates things." Everybody in the room started laughing, including Miller himself, and weirdly, once people saw that side of him, it became impossible to fully fear him anymore. That transformation spread through town surprisingly fast. Soon everybody knew about the puppies. Children started waving at Miller more. People brought chew toys to the station. One elderly woman knitted tiny dog sweaters for all 7 puppies, though Miller reportedly tried refusing them at first because he claimed sweaters were operationally unnecessary. The sweaters won. There was also something deeply funny about how seriously Miller approached puppy care. He made feeding schedules, medical charts, bathroom rotation systems. At one point, he apparently built an actual corkboard in his kitchen, tracking each puppy's weight progression like an ongoing criminal investigation. But beneath all the humor, people slowly realized something else too. Miller genuinely loved those dogs, probably more openly than he'd loved anything in years. You could see it in tiny moments. The way he automatically bent down to wipe mud off before entering the house. The way he carried sleeping puppies carefully against his chest after late-night feedings. The way he stopped taking overtime shifts because he needed to get home. That sentence alone shocked people who knew him, because Officer Miller had always acted like there was nothing waiting for him at home before. There was one winter night where Miller responded to a bad highway accident during a snowstorm and ended up working nearly 16 straight hours. Another officer offered to check on the puppies while Miller finished paperwork downtown. Miller apparently declined immediately and drove home himself through dangerous roads afterward because, in his exact words, "They've already been abandoned once." That line spread around town for years because I think everybody understood he wasn't only talking about dogs anymore. Eventually, the puppies grew large enough for adoption, and surprisingly, that became emotionally difficult for Miller, much harder than anybody expected. One by one, local families adopted them. Miller personally interviewed every household himself too, which people joked felt more intense than applying for government security clearance. One family later said Miller spent 20 minutes asking where the dog would sleep during thunderstorms. By the time only Moose remained, the entire department already knew what was happening. Moose wasn't going anywhere. Honestly, the dog basically belonged to Miller from the beginning. The final puppy adoption happened nearly 6 months after that rainy alleyway discovery. By then, Miller's entire personality had shifted in subtle ways. Not softer exactly, just more reachable. He smiled more, talked longer, attended neighborhood events occasionally. One summer afternoon, there was even a photo in the local newspaper showing Officer Miller sitting cross-legged in a park surrounded by children while Moose slept across his lap. Most people who knew the old Miller would have thought the image was fake, but maybe my favorite part of this whole story happened years later after Miller retired. One of the younger officers visited him at home and described seeing something unexpected taped beside the refrigerator in Miller's kitchen. It was the original feeding schedule he made for the puppies all those years earlier. Old, faded, corners curling. The officer asked him why he still kept it. Miller apparently looked over at Moose sleeping near the couch before answering, because that's when the house stopped feeling empty. And honestly, I think that might have been the first completely honest thing anybody ever heard him say.